Hi there, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. In this episode, I am joined by Peter Ekstein, the founder of the Jewish Year of Service program, which sends recent Jewish high school graduates to Israel for a year of service. Enjoy my conversation with Peter Ekstein. Pete, thanks for joining me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, where you grew up, what you've been involved with in your sort of formative and adult years. Why don't we start there?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm from Toronto. I'm 60 years old. I've lived in Toronto my entire life, except for a stint in about 1 year in Israel, when I lived in Kibbutz Yugura after grade 8, grade 13. I'm a businessman. I've been in the lumber business my entire life up until about a few years ago. I've been a community guy since my mother schlepped me to a UJA telethon when I was, 16-year-old, something like that, and got the bug for it. And I've sat on the board of many of the Jewish organizations in Toronto, including the Federation, for 10 years. Very close to Israel, strong Zionist, lots of great friends there. Love spending time with soldiers over there, involved in a couple organizations helping out the IDF. And a few years ago, I decided it was time to sell my business and move on to the next phase of my life.
So take us back to, have you always been a proud Jew, an engaged Jew, or was there something in your life that sort of put you on that path?
Hey, good question. When people ask me, who are you? What are you? Usually the first answer that comes to my mind is I'm a Jew. I'm not a very observant Jew, to be honest with you. I'm more of a traditional Jew, but it's a very strong, overwhelming part of my identity. I'm the child of Holocaust survivors. My mom was a child survivor. My dad's family basically escaped Czechoslovakia on the last boat out in 1939, but came penniless to Canada. So I consider them both survivors of one manner or another, but my mom lost her entire family. And, I grew up hearing her stories. We had lots of survivors in our home all the time. So hearing their stories, I think I read every book that was ever written on the Holocaust, watched every movie that was ever written. And same with Israel. One of the first books I remember reading that wasn't an ABC book was Leon Uris's Exodus. And it's a little bit of a mythological, dramatically incorrect. I don't know if that's the right word for it. It doesn't cover everything exactly the way things happen. But if you read it, you couldn't help but fall in love with Israel a little bit. And my parents took us when I think it was about 15 years old, to Israel. It was my first trip there, maybe 14. And it was like a couple of days after the Entebbe raid, and that the people were brought back to Israel, and the whole country was celebrating. And it was just an unbelievable, amazing atmosphere and feel in the country. And it's hard to explain, but I kind of got off the plane and stepped on the ground and felt like this is where I belong to a large degree. Unfortunately, I never ended up staying long enough to completely belong, but my heart's belonged there ever since. I went the following summer with the Zionist group, and then I went when I was 18, like I said, and lived on a kibbutz for a year. And I wasn't going to come back, except my brother was getting married, and my parents told me if I didn't come back for the wedding, they'd kill me. And then I came back, and my mother laid on the Polish Jewish guilt and had me stick around for university for at least a year. And that's when I met my future wife. And, just kind of ended up being in Toronto. Family, business, parents, kids. It got more and more difficult to leave. And I don't think my wife was jumping right away anyways. So we go there a lot. I figured out a way to do business in Israel because I was looking for a way to get over there more often. Turned out to be a half decent business, selling lumber into Israel for many, many years. And between business and pleasure and charitable work, I was probably in Israel 3-4 times a year for the last 30 years, except for the COVID hiatus of 2 years, which was extremely painful.
Very interesting. I'm curious to know, being the son of Holocaust survivors, I know you mentioned that you had a lot of other survivors in your home and in your community, but I'm sure you also were surrounded by both Jews and non-Jews who obviously were not directly impacted by the Holocaust. I'm curious to know, like, is there one thing that stands out in your upbringing as the son of Holocaust survivors that you said, that was the way that I was raised in that way, or the things that my parents used to tell me, like those things are directly because of the Holocaust? Like, can you pinpoint one or two of those things that sort of separate a Jewish descendant of the Holocaust versus one that hasn't, and certainly people that are not Jewish whatsoever?
Sure. So first of all, without being able to explain it completely, I can tell you that within 2 minutes of talking to someone, I can tell if their parents were survivors or not. It's just, there's something about the way people talk and the way they think. But as far as something specific, yeah, and it's not necessarily a great thing to know, but maybe it's a lesson, is that no matter how good things seem, everything can be taken away from you in a moment. And I've learned that that's not just a saying, it's actually reality. And it's happened to both of my parents. My father's family were very wealthy cattle dealers in Czechoslovakia. My dad used to tell me that he had a chauffeur and a nanny when he was a little kid, which in Europe in those days, not that many people had. But they came to Canada penniless, absolutely penniless. His father was 42 or so at the time, never really was able to recreate a good, job, income, business for himself. He drove a pickup truck and did a little scrap dealing for a while, but they lost everything. And on my mom's side, they lost even more because she lost her parents. She lost most of her family. She had one aunt who survived the war. Unfortunately, she lost her husband and 2 of her children. And she was on Oscar Schindler's list. So she survived the war because of Schindler. And it's a long story, but at the end found my mom and brought her to Canada when she was like 13 years old, something like that. So yeah, no matter how good things are, no matter what things seem like, they can be taken away from you really quickly, which doesn't mean you have to hide in the corner and shake, but means that you need to know what's going on. You need to know what's going on in the world. Keep yourself as up to date as you possibly can, and be prepared to react if necessary. And maybe as a corollary to that, which is a little bit appropriate for the time that we're in right now with Russia invading Ukraine, is that I like to tell people, when a really bad guy tells you they're going to do something really bad, believe them. When Iran says they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, believe them. It's what they want to do. When Russia said, they want to when Putin said he wants to recreate the Holy Soviet, the Holy Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, whichever one you want, believe him. I was having bets with people for the last couple of months, is he going to invade? Isn't he? So of course he's going to invade. Anyways, believe them.
So for the Jewish world, like how, because we have a very strong Jewish state, we have a very strong Jewish diaspora with extremely successful people like yourself in a variety of different fields and sectors and professions, and even positions of power. So how do we use that lesson? Because today, I would say for the average Jew, things are relatively good. The fact that we have a Jewish state sort of preemptively prevents another Holocaust, another pogrom, another disaster, or any sort of violence against the Jewish people on sort of a mass scale. Obviously, you probably can never get rid of sort of the micro anti-Semitic events. How do we use the lesson that you just described in the Jewish world today moving forward? What are some of the things that people listening to this can say, Yeah, that's something that I can get behind and start doing, or start rallying my community to do.
I think the first and most important part is that we need a strong Israel. And, I know I say to people that the last, 60, 70 years, whatever it's been since the war, and the first 50 years of my life anyways, were the best 50 years that anybody's ever lived anywhere at any time in the history of the world. Growing up in Toronto, Canada, it's a pretty good country and had a pretty good time. But if you zoom out a little bit and look at it from 60,000 feet, things don't always stay the same, and things aren't always so good. So to assume that it will be the same is a mistake. You can't assume that it'll continue to be the same, which means you have to be knowledgeable and aware of what's going on, like I said before. But we need to keep Israel strong, and I think it's a responsibility of Jews all over the world in whatever manner that they can, whether it be by making aliyah, whether it be by supporting organizations in Israel, or whether it just be by visiting Israel and building relationships and having friends there. It's our responsibility to keep Israel strong. That's the most important one. And then the secondary one is Jews living in the diaspora. We need to be able to look with clear eyes where we're headed, the challenges that we're being faced with, and come up with some creative solutions on how to deal with them so that we can continue to be a strong community outside of Israel as well. I think they depend upon each other to a degree. I know most Israelis don't like it when I say, we depend on each other. But listen, Israelis don't need our money today, thank goodness. But the influence that Jews still have in many of the democratic countries in the world, I think to some degree are very important to Israel, and they wouldn't want to be without them. And as a diaspora community, we need Israel. It's that simple.
So speaking of creative ideas, you yourself have been working on one the last few years. I know it doesn't have an official name yet, but we can call it for the sake of this podcast, the Year of Service in Israel. You are helping to bring high school graduates, Jewish high school graduates, currently from the Toronto area, but I understand you want to expand that, of course, over time, and bringing them to Israel for a year of service and coupling them with Israeli high school graduates and what's known in Israel as sort of a mechinot, which is sort of a prep school, a prep academy in Israel, in between the end of high school and recruitment into the army, and for Jews abroad, the end of high school and the beginning of university studies. You've been doing this for the last few years. Before we get into where we're at today with it, how did you come up with this idea, and why do you think it's so important?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm one of those Jews who stays up at night worrying about the Jews. And at the time, which is maybe 3-4 years ago, actually things haven't really changed that much. The biggest issues that we're facing the Jews, especially in the diaspora, were the fact that Israel and the diaspora seem to be moving further and further apart. And, if you look at the most recent surveys that were in the States, I forget who ran them, but it suggested that 25% of American Jews thought Israel was an apartheid state, and 22% of them thought that Israel commits genocide. It's hard to believe, but even if they were off by a little, those numbers are absolutely frightening. So Israel and the diaspora are moving further and further apart. And our next generations in the diaspora continuously are identifying us Jewishly. Everything from day school attendance to synagogue attendance to camp, Jewish day camp attendance, overnight camp attendance. And the biggest, metric, if you want to call it that, is the rate of intermarriage. When I sat on the board of Federation 10 years ago or so, the intermarriage rate in Toronto was about 10% outside of the Orthodox community. Now it's 42%. It's 72% in the US. And if you do the math, at 72% within 2 generations, you have less than 1/10 of the Jews that you have today. Now, there's opportunities there too. It's not all on the negative side. There's not always a -1. It can be seen as a +1. but the odds are against you. The numbers that they have of children and grandchildren of intermarried rates, the odds of them remaining Jewish aren't anywhere near as good as we would like them to be. So those are the couple things going through my head. You can add to that the fact that our kids graduating from grade 12 in North America, I can speak about Toronto anyways, aren't as mature as they should be, aren't responsible enough, aren't ready to go to university yet. Yes, we're sending them off to live by themselves in a different city, with a bunch of kids their same age, and just kind of hoping things will work out. They're not ready, but they're really not ready to face the level of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, which is anti-Semitism, that exists on campus today. So those are kind of the three overriding problems. And, having been someone who spends a heck of a lot of time in Israel and has great Israeli friends and watched their kids grow up, it was obvious to me that really we've become two completely different cultures. Israel is a culture of duty and responsibility. Kids understand from a very young age that they are part of something bigger than themselves, that they're going to have to contribute to. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them do it happily and willingly because they understand why they're doing it and who they're doing it for. In North America, there just isn't anything close to that. Unfortunately, most Jewish kids outside of Orthodox communities don't feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves and don't feel like they have a responsibility towards anything other than themselves. And that's probably the biggest reason why Israel and the diaspora is moving further and further apart, because they just become two completely different cultures. And young North Americans like to try and view Israel through their American lens. And they see Israelis, Palestinians, well, that's kind of like whites versus blacks in North America. And it's not even close, but that's the lens that they view it through. And they're not speaking the same language, so it's very hard to bridge that gap. So taking that into consideration, I said, well, how do we bridge this? What can we do? And it occurred to me that forget the how, but the what if. What if we could change the paradigm in the diaspora? I was talking about Toronto at the time, but let's call it the diaspora, so that it becomes the thing to do, that after grade 12, we send our kids to Israel to do a year of service in Israel. And when I say a year of service, it doesn't necessarily mean military. I mean, it could by all means, but the programs that we're creating are social service programs. And the goals are that they come back from a year of living and volunteering side by side with Israelis of their age, that they come back more in love and connected to their Judaism, more in love connected to their Zionism, and feeling like they're part of something bigger than themselves that they've made a contribution to. And if you come back, checking off those boxes after a year, you tend to keep those things with you for the rest of your life. It's not 1 week, it's not 10 days like a birthright, which is also great, but for most people, 10 days isn't enough. You spend a year and you're changed. And if you have dozens or hundreds of kids coming back to your community like that every single year, you change the trajectory of your community. So that was kind of the mindset behind it all.
And where do you see this program going? I mean, what's the evolution in your mind? How do you want to expand it, widen it, bring in different communities outside of Toronto? Take us into sort of your vision.
So, I mean, my original Nirvana vision, as I like to call it, is, 10 years from now, hopefully, thousands of kids from all over the world graduating grade 12, Jewish kids going to Israel, doing a year of service, going back to their communities, changing the trajectory of their communities, but also changing the relationship between Israel and the diaspora forever. That's still my vision. Having said that, interestingly enough, there's been a lot of conversation about these types of things lately. If you I mean, maybe a month ago or so, Zach Bogdan, who is the CEO of the JCC in Palo Alto, published a good book called Why Do Jewish, which is a great read. I suggest all of you that you read it. And it culminates in the last chapter with what he calls his leap year, LEAP. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for today, but part of it is service, a part of it is education. And really it checks off the same boxes that we're trying to check off, maybe in slightly different proportions, but it checks off exactly the same boxes and has the same goals that they're trying to achieve. And then a couple of weeks ago, Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky penned an article that came out in Mosaic. I think it came out in New Philanthropy. And they talked about how we need to change the paradigm in the diaspora, that as opposed to asking Jewish kids, where are you going to college next year? We need to be asking Jewish kids, what are you going to be doing in Israel next year? That they also have come to the conclusion that a year in Israel is something that's needed for all sorts of reasons. And they're focusing a little bit more on preparing them for university from a critical thinking point of view. So I think they're talking about more in-classroom education, also with some, volunteer quote unquote service component. So there's people talking about it, and Young Judea had an article yesterday about they have their year course, but they're again pushing that it should become universal, that every Jewish kid should spend a year in Israel. So there's been a lot of talk about it, interestingly enough. Everybody has a slightly different vision, but in the case of Zach and Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky, they're just still talking about it. We've actually done something about it. This is we're in our third year right now. Unfortunately, our beginning of our second year was March 15th, 2020, and we had 15 kids signed up and another 15 or so in the pipeline that we knew we were going to get. And then COVID hit. And, Canadians have a slightly different risk profile than Americans. And interestingly enough, talking to Massa, they had a lot of increase during coronavirus for Massa because parents wanted to get their kids out of the US and Israel, which seemed to be dealing with the virus better than North America at the time. Canadians, they're hunkered down, and our 15 kind of whittled down to 8. And we basically lost, a year and a half, call it 2 years worth of the program. But even though we lost it, we had 8 kids going last year. There are 9 kids in Israel right now. And in our pilot year, which literally we, after 2 months kind of took off with, we had 6 kids. So we've got about 23 alumni after the end of this year. And we're hoping for lots more this year.
That's amazing. You told me a story offline, which I'd love you to retell to the listeners. You were able to get a law changed in Israel, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that's obviously positively impacted the Year of Service program?
Sorry, Josh, I didn't hear you completely. A large?
You said that you were able. We talked offline, and you said that you were able to get a law changed in Israel, which, of course, has had a positive impact not just on your program, but I imagine on other programs. Can you tell us that story for our listeners?
Yeah, well, I won't take full responsibility for it, but maybe I'll take a little bit of credit. When I first come to Israel, one of the first people I met with was the CEO of Massa, which was Liran Avisar at the time, a wonderful woman, supercharged energy buddy. But and she was very receptive. She fell in love with the idea, and she was the one who actually pushed for a pilot project like 3 months after the day we had that conversation. And she asked me, who else are you speaking to when you're in Israel? And I mentioned a couple of programs that existed that I thought might be good partners for us. And she said, well, have you spoke to Shirat Leumi? And I said, you know what, that's a good question. They're kind of on my list. I really don't know who to talk to there. I'm not sure exactly what they could, do to help me, but I'd love to learn from them what they're doing and maybe how to take some of that concept back to Toronto. So I said, but I don't know anybody there. So she pulls out her phone in typical Israeli fashion, punches a few numbers and says, Reuven, I got a guy you need to speak to. He'll be in your office in a half an hour, literally. She put me in a cab and I showed up in Reuven Pinsky's office a half hour later, who's the Director General of Shirut Leumi. And I started to tell him, he said, you got 15 minutes. And I started to tell him my pitch. And after 5 minutes, he says, okay, stop. I said, that's it? You're kicking me out already? He said, no. He said that he had only been in the job a couple of weeks. And he actually took the job because one of the things he wanted to try and figure out was how to involve diaspora kids more into the Shirut Leumi concept program. And he thought this was a great way of doing it. But at that point in time, Israel law was such that you had to be Israeli to participate in Shirut Leumi. And I guess there was liability reasons and there was subsidy reasons, etc. But you said, don't worry, I'll talk to Bibi and we'll get this thing passed. And then there were 4 elections. So it took a little while, but last December, a law was passed that now non-Israelis are allowed to participate in Shirut Leumi. And the programs that we've been running out of Toronto up until now anyways, have partnered with Shirut Leumi. So our kids have been side by side volunteering with young Israelis doing their Shirut Leumi and Shirut Leumi programs. And hopefully that opened the door for a big sea change going forward.
Very interesting. Well, I'd like to move into sort of the future of Jewish part of the episode. Pete, I want to ask you, what would you like to see happen in the Jewish world in the next 10 years?
With respect to my program or in general?
In general, but also with your program.
So, you know, I said from day one, if you can do it in Toronto, you can do it anywhere. Listen, it would really need, and we're not quite at that stage yet. We're just getting to the point, because we missed those couple of years, where I hope after this year we'll have something really solid that we can show people. And once we have, you know, that little bit of success under our belt, hopefully having 25 to 30 kids go this year, that we can take that show and take it on the road a little bit and go speak to organizations in North America. How to get it across, you know, the various communities is a good question. I don't know if it will be through the federations. I don't know if it will be through the JCCs. It might be through the youth groups, through NCSY and BBYO, things like that. You know, I'm hoping that the government of Israel, in one manner or another, will take this on as partly their responsibility as well. We're partnered with Masa right now, which is wonderful. They've been great to us. We have 3 programs that we're running, that we're recruiting for this year, and Masa will be looking at overriding those, providing some subsidies to all the kids for those programs. But that's different than going out to community by community and trying to push the year service program. I talked a little bit earlier about the other people who are, you know, having ideas about year programs and leap years and prep years, etc. And people ask me, okay, a couple things. Why Israel? Why can't it be, you know, with Israelis working in Africa or something like that? You know, Project 10 does things like that. And my answer is because one of the key goals of the initiative is that they fall in love with the state of Israel. And you can't do that when you're volunteering in Africa. You have to immerse yourself. You have to be in the country. You have to live amongst the people. You have to go on hikes. You have to learn about its history while you're standing on its ground. And so that's my why Israel, because we have to be Zionist communities in the diaspora. It's crucial for both of ours long-term existence. So that's the why Israel. You know, why a year, 10 months, a year, same answer to some degree. It has to be immersive. You know, I chaired, I chaperoned 1 year and chaired twice on the March of the Living. And this little plug, my mother was 18 years a survivor on the March of the Living, and she was the face of the March of the Living in Toronto. So she kind of got me involved. And it's an amazing experience for these kids. They spend a week in Poland and then a week in Israel. And I can tell you that at the beginning, before going, we had 300 kids from Toronto going when I was chairing it. And you had 300 kids in a classroom, throwing things at each other, having a hard time getting to pay attention to somebody speaking at the front of the room. They were typical North American teenagers, who didn't really know what they were going to, except that it had become the thing to do. It was the grade 11 trip in Toronto for Jewish kids. But by the end of the trip, every one of them had something important and passionate and heartfelt to say about their 2-week experience. And you could just see that every one of them wanted to do something to help. They were there, you had them at that point. Unfortunately, there wasn't a heck of a follow-up going back in Toronto. I'm not sure what happens in other cities, but we didn't have the follow-up that was necessary. And, it's 2 weeks. After a couple of months, these kids tend to forget those 2 weeks and go on with the rest of their life. And maybe there's a few who stayed committed, but most of them, it falls off. And, birthright, similar. You're the exception. I know you came after 5 days, called your parents and said you're not coming home. So that's wonderful. And I know there are others like that, but you're the exception. It's 10 days and it's nice, and some of it stays with you, but most of it kind of disappears. But after a year, it doesn't go away, whether you want it to or not. I'm exhibit A, it's in your blood, it's in your DNA, and it's in with you forever. So it needs to be in Israel. It needs to be a year. And most importantly for me, ours is called the year of service, but there are different components to it. We're still, just in early days. So when we had to make a decision on what percentage of the time should be spent on service, we said, I don't know, say 50%. Okay, so that's not in concrete anywhere, but it's enough that you can call it a year of service, that's one of the primary reasons that are going. But we're providing also education on Israel, in class and hikes. We're providing education on Jewish identity and Jewish pride through Jewish Agency. And we've partnered with Stand With Us, who, while our kids are in Israel, are giving them the tools that they need so that when they get back to university, when they come home, they're going to be prepared to deal with the anti-Semitism that they're going to face on campus, both from students and from professionals, from educators. So although we have those different components, service is the primary reason. Why? I think that it's something that not only makes you feel part of something bigger than yourself that you've contributed to, which is a very powerful feeling, by the way. And anybody who does any sorts of meaningful volunteer work will tell you they get more out of it than they put into it. But it also brings back that spirit of duty and responsibility to your community. And again, if you have dozens or hundreds of kids like that coming back to your community all the time, it will change the culture in your community to one of duty and responsibility, both to Israel and within the community, which will just, make those communities stronger going forward. So that's why I think service it's very different than spending a year in a classroom, at IDC learning whatever it may be, and whether it's, whether it's on Jewish content or whether it's on the topic that you want to make your career in. There's lots of internships here, which are wonderful too. It gets kids over here. So, at the end of the day, I'm just happy if kids come here, but I think that the service component is something that can just really change the face of the diaspora. And if you can spread that around the world, because all of the diaspora communities are in the same situation. They may be at slightly different times in their evolution, but they're all facing those same challenges that we're facing in North America right now. So I really believe the service component deals with that much more effectively than any of the other programs that are out there.
That's amazing. I'm curious to know, what's like one thing that you thought as you were developing the Year of Service program a few years ago? Like, what's one thing you thought uh, about what the program would be or how it would go that you now today no longer believe to be true?
The good news is most of the things that that I envisioned are working out the way that I had hoped they would. Um, I would have loved to get more institutional support in North America. I have talked to a number of the organizations that I had mentioned previously, JCCs, JFNA, BBYO, et cetera, and they all want to see something. Call me when you got something you can show me that there's been a little bit of success. And even in Toronto, I'm working with the UJ Federation, who've been wonderful and have provided a lot of help. The leading from the front, if you want to call it that, hasn't been there. And it's wonderful that lately we've had guys like Troy and Natan Sharansky write the article that they've written, because they've got a megaphone, they've got a pulpit, and they've decided to use it. And they probably accomplished more for spending a year in Israel after high school in one article than I've accomplished in 3 years of pushing and shoving, just because they have that megaphone. I'd love to see some of the Jewish organizations take this idea and run with it.
Amazing. Pete, how can people find out more about the program and also be in touch with you if they're interested in learning more?
So now you're catching me off guard, because I should know the website, but there is a website. I can get that for you. It's a web page within the UJA of Toronto website. So if you Google Jewish Service UJA Toronto, you'll end up on the web page, and it will tell you about the programs that we're recruiting for this year. I didn't have the chance to mention what they are, so quickly I will tell you. The 3 programs, one is called Aravim. It's being run by Hanor Tzioni in Israel, who are the partner of the sister organization of our Canadian Young Judea in Toronto. And they're running the evergreen program, the one that I've described in the conversation that we've had with the guys so far. But we're running 2 other programs. One, we're partnering with World Bnei Akiva and running a program called Shalem, which is a pilot project for Orthodox girls who, the Orthodox community has done a phenomenal job in getting kids to go to Israel after high school to spend a year either in yeshiva or Opana. And I think they have a huge percentage of the population that they have coming to Israel. But many of them aren't meant for a full year of study. And in talking to some of the people at World Bnei Akiva, we came up with this idea. We created a 50% of the year study, 50% of the year doing volunteer work. So that's Shalem for Orthodox girls. And like I said, that's a pilot project. And we're running a reverse Shinshanim program with the city of Eilat. Eilat is the partner of Toronto Federation. And we have 6 kids going to Eilat this year to participate in the Shinshanim program. Toronto was just coincidentally one of the initiators of the Shinshanim program. My friend Michael Diamond was very involved in it. And I believe up until COVID anyways, we by far have had the most number of Shinshanim in Toronto. We have well over 200 alumni of the Shinshanim program in Toronto. And I think we were getting like 25, 26 pre-COVID, and we'll get back there again pretty quickly every year. And for those of you who don't know what the Shinshanim project is in the diaspora, it's kids in Israel who want to do their Shnat Shirut in this program. They are embedded in the communities. They live with families, usually, maybe changing homes twice while they're here, maximum 3 times, so that they're not moving around that much. So they live with the Jewish families here. They're embedded in our schools, our day schools, in our synagogues, and in our camps. And their number one role is to teach North American young people about Israel, the good, the bad, and the ugly, not just the fairy tale version, but the challenges that Israel has as well, and how they are dealing with them. And they talk about their year as well, and they've become some of our best ambassadors because they're doing their year of service right now in North America, in Toronto, and no one can speak better to talking to North American kids about doing a year of service than the Israeli kids who are doing their year of service right now. So we're doing a pilot reverse engineering program in Eilat. Like I said, they had spots for 6 kids. They wanted to start small. And those are the 3 programs we're running.
That's amazing. Pete, appreciate your time and keep up the great work.